So a question I've been getting a lot lately in the comments is, how did I get into this? Specifically food history. I'm not a chef or a professional cook, I'm not a historian, so kind of a weird topic for a YouTube channel. Well, it all started with the Great British Bake Off. Specifically the fantastic history segments that they used to have with the old hosts Mel and Sue. Mel, Sue, I miss you so much. Please, let's have lunch. My favorite episodes were always the episodes where they would make some dish from history, and then Mel and Sue would go discuss the history, and it was like it brought a bit of history into the tent. And I decided that I wanted to recreate some of the historic dishes that they were doing because while I don't really have anything in common with a medieval king or a Victorian social climber, if I made something that they would have tasted and then tasted it myself, I felt like it would create this kind of imaginary line through history so I could feel a little bit of what they felt. Unfortunately, before watching the Great British Bake Off, I didn't know squat about cooking. I didn't even know that you were supposed to add salt when heating up the water to boil pasta. So I had a bit of a learning curve, but I decided to teach myself how to bake, mainly through the wonderful masterclasses that Mary Berry taught. Anyway, the episode that really got me geared up to learn how to bake was an episode where they mentioned a certain medieval cookbook, and I cannot find it. Probably it's not available here in the United States, and at some point I watched it when I was either over there or took it off the internet. Anyway, the book that they mentioned is this, The Form of Curry, England's first cookbook. It's a collection of recipes from around the year 1390, compiled of the chef master cooks of King Richard II, King of England after the conquest. So today, after you hit that like button, we are going to dive into the wonder that is the form of curry and make one of its quintessential sauces, galantine. This time on Tasting History. So the sauce that we're making today, galantine, appears several times in the form of curry, and each time the recipe is a little different. There are actually two recipes specifically for its use on pork, and neither of which is the same. So the recipe I'm going to use today is for kind of the base sauce, which could then be modified for use with beef, or fish, or chicken, or pork, or a lamprey if you've got that laying around, really whatever you want. So in modern English, the recipe reads, galantine. Take crusts of bread and grind them small. Do thereto powder of galangal, of cinnamon, ginger, and salt. Mix it with vinegar and pass it through a strainer and serve it forth. Now I don't know a ton about sauces, but they usually have some sort of liquid in there, which other than vinegar, this doesn't actually mention any liquid. And it's going to be kind of astringent if the only liquid in the sauce is vinegar. But whenever the sauce is mentioned elsewhere in the form of curry, it usually is made with either wine or the blood or juices of whatever meat it's going to go on. So we're going to add those in. So the meat that I'm going to use for this is pork shoulder, but you can use anything. But you do want something that's going to give off quite a bit of juice to help you make the sauce. So what you're going to need is a cup of liquid. First, get as much juice as you can and then top it off with wine. Red, white, doesn't matter. Then about 2 pieces of stale bread. You could also toast it, but if you're cooking something in the oven, the best way to make it kind of stale and dry real quick is just leave the bread out on top of the oven while you're cooking, and it'll be good to go by the time you're ready to make the sauce. This is my cat, by the way. Cersei, say hi. She's been in a mood. She just got a little brother and she ain't thrilled. So the next ingredient is a little hard to find, so I'll put a link in the description to where you can find it online, and that is galangal, or galangale. And that is actually where the sauce gets its name. So we want to use a liberal amount, so I'm taking 1 piece and grinding it up, which makes about 1.5 teaspoons. It's definitely worth getting because 1, it smells wonderful, and 2, we're going to be using it in some upcoming recipes. Then 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon and 1/4 teaspoon of ginger. So for all of the spices, I used heaping 1/4 teaspoons and heaping teaspoons because we really want to showcase the spice's flavor, and we will get into why in a little bit. Then some red or white wine vinegar to taste. I used about 2.5 tablespoons just to give you an idea. And then some salt, again, to taste. So first take your bread and crumble it up as fine as you can. Then whisk together the crumbs, the galangal, the cinnamon, and the ginger. Then in a saucepan over a low flame, heat your drippings and the wine if you ended up using any. Then add in the breadcrumb and spice mixture and whisk together. Then add in the vinegar and a little bit of salt and let it simmer for a few minutes, about 5 minutes, just to reduce down. Now while that simmers, let us take a look at where this lovely little recipe came from, the form of curry. So the 14th century is kind of a renaissance for cooking, or at least writing down recipes, because between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the year 1300, we don't know that much about what was being eaten by Europeans. We have some information, but no detail, no real recipes. Then in the 14th century, we have hundreds and hundreds of recipes with surprising detail coming at us from the kitchens of European royalty. The bulk of the recipes come from just 3 manuscripts. The first was the French Blvd du Tevant, followed by the Italian and written in Latin Liber de Cucina, or Book of Cookery. Finally, near the end of the 14th century, we have from England the Form of Curry, or the Method of Cooking. Now the title The Form of Curry didn't really become a thing until the 18th century, when Samuel Pegg compiled all the recipes into one book. Before that, they were just manuscripts that didn't completely match each other exactly. But the most famous, and probably the oldest, is a 6-meter-long vellum scroll kept at the British Library with 196 recipes on it. It bugs me that they didn't add 4 more to just make it an even 200 recipes, but maybe they ran out of room on the scroll, I don't know. Now we don't know the names of any of the master chefs who created these recipes, but we do know that they would have sat in the center of a massive kitchen wherever King Richard happened to be, because he was itinerant, he was always moving around from castle to castle. And they would have sat there barking orders to an army of between 200 and 300 cooks as they scalded, boiled, plucked, deboned, roasted, baked, and sauced dishes for hundreds if not thousands of guests of the king. All the while, a scribe would have been scribbling down whatever the master chef told him to put down, all of the recipes and whatever the king liked and didn't like. Compile all those recipes and you have the Form of Curry, which is why the recipes don't always match. They were probably made by several different master chefs and several different scribes over the period of about a decade. Anyway, it's really fitting that England's first cookbook be made by the chefs of Richard II, because say what you want about dear King Richie, and there is plenty to say, but he was an infamous gastronome. Food and feasting were always a big part of any court culture in medieval times, but King Richard II took it to a whole new level. Some historians actually credit him with kind of making that turn from the raucous medieval feasts of the Normans and the early Plantagenet kings into the more refined occasions that you'd associate with later kings, like the Tudors. He made sure that everyone washed their hands before the feast began, and he introduced the handkerchief to dab your mouth of food instead of wiping it on your sleeve, like I do. He also popularized the use of spoons. It's said that every member of the royal household carried one on them at all times. And many of the manners that we still adhere to today, like no belching at dinner, no elbows on the table, and not talking with your mouth full, were strictly adhered to at King Richard's court. Now, a medieval feast, whether it was Richard's or anyone else's, was not just about food. It was about politics. It was a way to show off your wealth to everyone around you, often by showcasing a vast array of dishes, and the Form of Curry has a vast array of dishes. While it has plenty of recipes for pork and beef and chicken, just as popular then as they are today, it also showcases dozens of different species of fish and fowl and other sea life, and really focuses on game, which could only be hunted by the king and his courtiers. Then there are recipes for things like whale and porpoise, which would have been available only to the wealthiest of diners. It also eschews commoner ingredients like butter and replaces it with precious olive oil, which would have had to come all the way from near the Mediterranean, or a fine, refined white lard called white grease. Sounds pretty fancy. Now, as impressive as porpoise and white grease might have been, the best way to show your wealth in medieval England was with spices, and the Form of Curry is absolutely riddled with them. Cinnamon, mace, clove, galangal, long pepper, ginger, cubebs, grains of paradise, spikenard, caraway, the list goes on, and they weren't just used for their flavor, but for their color as well. Many recipes are tinted red with sandalwood or gold with precious saffron. There are almost no recipes that don't showcase spices, and usually it's 2 or 3 at least. In a few weeks we're going to make hippocras, which is a spiced wine from the form of curry, which uses no less than 9 spices. Very expensive drink. I've actually had to take out a second mortgage just to make it. And based on the notes from the royal spiceries, these spices were used in copious amounts, a lot more than we'd typically use today, especially in Western cooking. The dishes were probably more akin to the highly spiced foods of modern India, which makes sense. That's how you were going to show your wealth. A little ground pepper ain't going to impress nobody. Now the chefs also created their own secret spice mixtures, probably similar to the Colonel's 11 herbs and spices. The most notable in the form of curry were powder 4 and powder douce. And while these would have varied from chef to chef, most historians think that powder 4 had a ginger or a pepper base and powder douce had a sugar base. And that is the ingredient that really makes the form of curry stand out when compared to the other 14th century manuscripts. While the French Blvd mentions sugar 8 or 9 times, it is present in a third of the recipes in the form of curry. And not just in what you would think of as desserts, because the concept of desserts being sweet and entrees being savory, that hadn't really been developed. In fact, the whole idea of dessert was just in its infancy then. And so sugar is treated like any other spice. You were just as likely to find sugar in a tart as you were rubbed into a roast goose. And that's why most medieval sauces read more like American barbecue than a French béarnaise sauce. But by the smell of our galantine, I don't think it's going to taste anything like either of them. So let's check on it. So once your sauce has reduced down to the thickness that you want, give it a taste and tweak the salt and the vinegar if you need to, then pass the sauce through a strainer just to make sure you get rid of any gall and gall bark. So here we are. It smells really nice. Very kind of perfumey, with a little bit of citrusy in there maybe. Let's give it a shot. First of all, I did that pork amazingly. Just throwing that out there. That's wonderful. That's really, really nice. Such an interesting flavor, and in the best way possible. Interesting because I was worried that it was going to have a eucalyptus flavor because the galangal kind of has a eucalyptus camphor scent, but it doesn't. It's there, but it's so mild. It's more of like these kind of citrusy notes coming through, and then the cinnamon playing off of that. Really, really nice. And I could see this being used on absolutely anything. Chicken, fish, pork, beef, doesn't matter. Even just like vegetables. It's just a really nice sauce. I'd say be careful on the vinegar because it could easily tip over into vinegary. Really, really good. Now, if you want to see more recipes from the form of curry, I've made a playlist, I think right down here, with all of the form of curry recipes that I've done here on Tasting History. So make sure to hit that like button, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Hi everyone, welcome to Tasting History. I'm your host, Max Miller, and today we're going to be making one of my favorite desserts, a cheesecake. But not just any cheesecake, because just like me, 14th century kings also had great taste. So we're going to be making a 14th century cheesecake called a sambocade. This time on Tasting History. Now the recipe we're using today comes from the kitchens of King Richard II, around 1390. And recipe writers at this time were pretty vague about things, so the recipe just says, make a crust. Not too helpful. What kind of crust did they want? Did they want a hot water crust? Probably not. Did they want like a fair flour crust, which is like a today's pie crust? Maybe. But I'm gonna be taking maybe a little bit of liberty here and use a tart crust. It's delicious, it's super easy to make, and most importantly, all of the ingredients in the tart crust would have been available in Richard's kitchens. So let's get started. First, you'll need 2 sticks, about 226 grams of cold butter, 160 grams of icing sugar, 6 large egg yolks, and now keep those 6 egg whites because those are going to make an appearance later, 450 grams of plain flour, and just a pinch of salt. Now you don't need to write anything down. All of the ingredients are in the description down below, as well as the full recipe, both the original recipe and the translation I'm using today. Now you can actually use this tart crust for a modern day recipe because it's so delicious. But at this point I would put in maybe a little bit of vanilla or lemon zest or something to kind of give it some flavor. Now I'm not going to use anything extra because the cheesecake that we're making today has so much flavor that it's just not necessary. Now once you have your ingredients, go ahead and cut the butter into pieces, about a ½ inch, and sift in the icing sugar. Now you gotta sift it in because you'll get clumps otherwise, and we don't want clumps. Now go ahead and beat the sugar and the butter together, but start the mixer on low. Now I've never done this, of course, but I have heard of people starting it on high and powdered sugar going absolutely everywhere, and then their cat running through it and leaving little powdered sugar paw prints all the way up to the bed. I've never done that. Other people. Now once the sugar does start to become incorporated, you can kick it up to high and beat until smooth. Then add the egg yolks and beat on medium until somewhat incorporated. Now it's probably going to look a little curdled, but that's actually okay. It'll go away later on. Also, if you are going to be adding any flavor like vanilla, now is the time. Probably a teaspoon. That'd be good. Once the egg is incorporated, add in the pinch of salt and your flour and beat on the lowest setting for about 20 seconds. You want it to just start to come together as like a crumbly mixture. You don't want it to form a ball. Then you take a piece of parchment and lay it out onto your workspace, dump the dough onto it, divide the dough into 2 piles, set one aside, and spread the remaining pile into kind of an even layered circle. Then place another sheet of parchment over that and get rolling. Now like I said, this tart dough is so easy to work with, that's why I love it. You can just roll it out, it's so forgiving, it never sticks, you don't have to get it into a perfect circle, and later on, if it does kind of crumble away or anything while you're putting it into the dish, you can just patch it up on the sides. It's the best. I just love it. Now once you roll it to the thickness that you want, between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch, pop it in the fridge and leave it there for about 20 minutes. Now while the dough chills, preheat your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit and go ahead and smash that like button. Now that's actually the most important part of the recipe, because to paraphrase Pink Floyd, how can you have any cheesecake if you don't smash that like button? Now once the button's been smashed, go ahead and gather up the rest of your ingredients. For the filling, you will need 4 tablespoons of heavy cream, 150 grams of sugar, 2 tablespoons of dried breadcrumbs, and 6 egg whites. I told you they'd be back. Then either 3 tablespoons of dried elderflower or 6 tablespoons of fresh elderflower. This is actually the ingredient that gives the dish its name. Sambo cod comes from the Latin sambucus, which means elderflower. And lastly, the most important ingredient in a cheesecake, the cheese. You'll need 450 grams of either farmer's cheese or ricotta cheese, or if you want to really impress people, go ahead and make your own fresh cheese. It's actually really easy. Here's a link to the video where I walk you through it, and I'll put it down in the description as well. Now once everything is gathered, assuming it's been 20 minutes, you can go ahead and pull the dough out of the fridge. Now if it hasn't been 20 minutes, wait around, or you can check to see if the parchment sticks. If it sticks, keep it in there. If it doesn't stick, then it's good to go. Now I'm using an 8-inch springform pan for this, a cheesecake tin. Now you can use a 9-inch, which is more common, but the cheesecake won't be quite as thick. You can also just use a regular pie pan. Anything works, the recipe isn't specific, and frankly, the springform pan wouldn't have even existed back then, but it makes it look so nice, so that's why I'm using it. So go ahead and line your tin with the tart dough, then you can put a little design on the top if you want, and then line it with aluminum foil, add in some pie weights, and blind bake the crust at 425 Fahrenheit for 10 minutes. Now you probably think nothing of the fact that this cheesecake has a crust, but you'd be pretty flabbergasted if you were an ancient Greek athlete. Stick with me here. The first cheesecake that we know of came from ancient Greece. It was probably a savory version around 2000 BC made on the Isle of Samos. It was the traditional cake for ancient Greek weddings, and it was probably served to athletes at the first Olympic Games in 776 BC. Makes me wonder if Usain Bolt goes to the Cheesecake Factory to load up on carbs before he competes. I'm gonna say yes. These ancient Greek cheesecakes would have bared no resemblance to the modern New York-style cheesecake. To get a little closer to our modern dessert, we have to look to the recipes of Roman senator and historian Cato the Elder. In his treatise De Agricultura, he had 3 cheesecake recipes, including the first recipe known to have a crust. Now unfortunately for Cato, he didn't hire a very good marketing team, and so he named his crusted cheesecake placenta. And that is why you don't see it on a lot of menus today. But that was probably also the recipe that some plucky young Roman legion took up to Britannia, where, in the 14th century, a genius of unknown name added sugar. Sweet, sweet white gold. And that is the Sambo cod. So by now, the crust should be done blind baking. Take it out of the oven, remove the pie weights and the aluminum foil, and check the bottom. If it still looks a little raw, pop it back in without the pie weights for another 2 or 3 minutes. Otherwise, you're going to have a soggy bottom, and Mary Berry does not like a soggy bottom. Once you are happy with your crust, go ahead and turn the oven down to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, because that's what we're going to bake our cheesecake at. Now while the crust cools, it's time to get started on your filling. Combine the elderflower into the cream and let it soak for about 10 minutes. But don't relax, because while the elderflower soaks, you get to strain cheese. And this takes time. Take a strainer and put the cheese in just a bit at a time and press it through with the back of a spoon. It should come out the other side with the consistency of cream cheese. Once the cheese is through the strainer, put it into the stand mixer and whip on medium for about a minute. Then add the elderflower cream and your breadcrumbs and whip until incorporated. With the mixer still running on medium, slowly add the sugar, then whip until smooth. Now it's time for a beating of the egg whites. Now this is a very important step because it is the only leavening agent that is going to be in your cake. It's the air in the egg whites. So if you don't get enough air in there, if they don't get fluffy enough, then the cake is going to be short and dense and still delicious, but, you know, a little stodgy. So beat the egg whites past the frothy stage until they form nice, stiff white peaks. Then working quickly but gently, fold them into the cheese mixture until no streaks of white are left. You want to keep as much air in there as possible, so don't overmix it. Then pour the mixture into the crust and pop it in the oven at 375 for 50 minutes, or until there's just a slight wobble in the center. I would start checking it at about 45 minutes because ovens vary. It actually took my oven to 55 minutes, so, you know, it's not a science. Wait, it is. Never mind. Now while the cheesecake is in the oven, you should have plenty of time to ponder the question, how did this cheesecake become that cheesecake? Now the Sambo cod has a crust, it has sugar, so it's a dessert, but it's still not the same as a New York-style cheesecake. And that is because of the cheese. Around the time that King Richard was satisfying his sweet tooth with Sambo cod, his soldiers were off in France fighting to reclaim the lands lost by King John. That was the bad guy from Robin Hood. Now the lovely ladies of Neufchâtel-en-Bray in the north of France realized that although these English invaders were pillaging their towns, they were also kind of cute while they did it. Now they couldn't be overt in their affection, of course, so they took cheese and molded it into the shape of a heart, the Cœur de Neufchâtel. Then they'd give the cheese to the soldiers as a covert way to show their love. Isn't that romantic? The cheese became popular back in England and stayed popular until it made its way to America, where in 1872, William Lawrence tried his hand at making it himself. But whether on purpose or by accident, we don't know, but he added too much cream and dubbed his new concoction Philadelphia cream cheese. Then in 1929, an immigrant named Arnold Rubin, who already had a sandwich named after him, used this Philadelphia cream cheese to make a cheesecake. And that dessert was the first Lindy's New York-style cheesecake. But that's not what we're making. We're making a Sambo cod. So let's get back to it. So go ahead and open the oven, and if the cheesecake looks baked along the top and has just a slight wobble to it, that means it's done. Now it should have puffed up quite a bit, but it's going to deflate some. To diminish the deflation, you want to leave it in the oven. Turn the oven off and leave the door open just a crack while it slowly cools down. Quick tip, this actually also works for custard pies, like a pumpkin pie. Just leave the door open and let it slowly cool down and you won't get that unsightly crack along the top. After about 15 minutes, take it out of the oven and let it finish cooling to room temperature. Then you can either serve it plain or garnish it with some honey, or, as I did, some fresh berries. So that is the 14th century Sambo cod. Now as I said, all of the ingredients are listed down below along with the recipe, as well as links to some of the harder to find ingredients. Elderflower in this case. Now I'm sure you already have, but if you haven't, hit that like button, leave me a comment below, and go ahead and subscribe so you can join me next time on Tasting History. Cheese. Milk's leap to immortality. I really wish I could have gotten James Earl Jones to record that quote. Unfortunately, it's just me. But anyway, that was author Clifton Fadiman who said that, and frankly, I'm inclined to agree. But for me and for French royalty through the ages, one cheese leads the way. W-H-E-Y. It's brie. The cheese is brie. Today we're making a tarte de brie. Served at the table of King Richard II in the 14th century, this tart lifts what was once called the cheese of kings to new heights of creamy deliciousness. Brie and the tart it rode in on. This time on Tasting History. This recipe comes from that medieval collection of recipes that just keeps on giving, the form of curry. And I was actually thinking of doing an entire episode just on the form of curry, its history and everything. So if you think that'd be exciting or interesting, leave me a comment, and if you don't, also leave me a comment just to the contrary. And while you're down there, if you could tap that like button, it really helps the YouTube algorithm, which in turn really helps me. Now for this recipe, you'll need either a tart crust or a pie crust and its accompanying pan. And I have an excellent tart recipe, crust recipe, down in the description. It's actually from the medieval cheesecake episode that I did, but if you scroll to about a minute in, you get to that tart recipe and it's delicious. Just if you want to keep this period medieval, make sure not to add any vanilla, even though it's delicious. So once you have your crust selected, all you'll need is 1 pound of brie cheese, 6 egg yolks, 1/8 teaspoon of saffron, or about 10 threads ground up. Now I have a link in the description to where you can get saffron threads without breaking the bank. In fact, I will include links to most of my ingredients and the tools that I use down there. 3/4 teaspoon light brown sugar, or more if you want a sweeter tart. This is a medieval recipe, so it doesn't tell you how much sugar to actually use, so if you want it more like a dessert, I'd say go with 3 tablespoons. That would be delicious. 3/8 teaspoon powdered ginger, and a bit of salt. Now you can also sprinkle some nutmeg or cinnamon on the top. It's not in the recipe, but it adds some nice color. First, preheat your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit or 220 Celsius, and then roll out your tart dough. It should be about 1/8 inch thick, maybe a little bit thicker, and then line your tart tin or your pie pan, and then put some aluminum foil in there and fill that with pie weights. We're going to blind bake this tart. So once your oven is preheated, pop it in the oven for about 10 minutes, then when you take out the pie weights, and if it still looks kind of like you have raw dough, then pop it back into the oven for another 5 minutes without the pie weights. But if it looks all done, then you're good to go and you can let it cool. Now if you do have to put it back in without the pie weights, when you pull it out 5 minutes later, it's probably gonna have puffed up a little bit, so use something to kind of press that down just to get the hot air out. But make sure to be careful because that's gonna be some hot dough. Now as that crust cools, lower the temperature of the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or about 175 Celsius, and then separate your eggs and lightly beat them. Then take out the brie and either cut off the rind or kind of shave it off, and cut the cheese into small pieces. Now make sure to keep some of that rind because we're going to use it, because that's the best part, just like the abbot said. Let me explain that a little better. It's said that the most famous brie cheese, Brie de Meaux, originated with the monks at the priory of Roi de Brie. And the cheese got its big break in 774 when Emperor Charlemagne, on his way home from defeating the Lombards, stopped by the priory for a little nosh, as one does. The abbot, surprised at the emperor's sudden appearance, gave him the best that they had, which was, of course, the cheese. And Charlemagne ate the cheese and tossed away the rind, thinking, meh, I've had better. But then the abbot said, "Oh, Emperor Charlemagne, you must eat the rind. That is where all the flavor is, the true essence of brie." And so the emperor tried it, and he was so enraptured with the flavor of the brie rind that he decided that 2 cartloads of brie should be delivered every year henceforth to his palace in Aachen. Just think about it. In 774, having the Emperor Charlemagne give kudos to your brie, that would be like having Kylie Jenner tweet about it now. You can't buy that kind of publicity. And Charlemagne's epiphany was only the beginning of French royalty's love affair with brie. In 1217, King Philip Auguste gave out 200 rounds of cheese to the ladies of his court for a New Year's gift. Now, I'm not saying that King Philip Auguste seems cheap by giving out cheese for a gift, but you're the king. And in 1594, King Henri IV of France fell under the spell of brie as well, when his wife, Queen Margot, served it to him at their castle in Meaux. After that, it's said that Henri would only eat brie with the queen, rather than with his mistress. Now let's get back to the tart. Not the mistress. Our tart. Now when it comes to the cheese, we have to get it nice and smooth so it'll mix in well with the other ingredients. And there are a few ways of doing this. One, you could warm the cheese and then press it through a sieve. And I will link to a video where you can see me pressing cheese through a sieve. It takes a long time, and frankly, I do not encourage you to do it. So if you're seeking permission to save some time and just use a blender, permission granted. So add your cheese to a blender and then add the beaten egg and mix together until smooth and creamy. This also works, though maybe not quite as well with egg beaters if that's what you have. Then add your saffron, the brown sugar, the ginger, and the salt, and give it another mix. Now set that aside and go back to the crust, which should be cool by now. So we're going to take that rind that we saved and sprinkle just a little bit, not too much, all over the bottom of it, because as delicious as brie is, the flavor is rather mild and it can be overshadowed by some of the other flavors that we're putting in there, so that rind is just going to help the brie shine through like the star that it is. Then gently spread your cheese mixture into the crust without disturbing the rind on the bottom, and smooth the top. Here's where, if you want, you can add that optional nutmeg or cinnamon on the top just to give it some color. Finally, put a shield over the crust. It can be like the one that I'm using here, I'll put a link to that one, or you can just use aluminum foil and wrap it around the sides. It's just there to stop the crust from burning since we've already baked it. Then put your tart into the oven for 30 to 40 minutes or until it looks set and starts to brown. So while that bakes, let us leave the Middle Ages and turn to another French king who loved brie so much that he lost his head. The last king to be brie-sauted with brie just happened to be the last king of France before the monarchy fell. In June of 1791, losing faith that that whole French Revolution thing was just going to blow over, King Louis XVI decided to flee the revolting peasants of Paris for the safety of his fortress in Montmedy 200 miles away. Now this was a complicated escape plan which involved sneaking out of the Tuileries Palace through unguarded doors at midnight, changing clothes to disguise themselves as servants, using false passports and bodyguards to take a carriage through the back streets of Paris, and then exchanging carriages and making a mad dash for the fortress. But what should have been a well-choreographed flight to safety ended up being more like a sped-up chase scene set to the Benny Hill theme song. Before they even got to the carriage, Marie Antoinette got lost and spent several minutes wandering the streets of Paris outside the palace. Then when they finally got underway, it was in a rather conspicuous 6-horse-drawn carriage. And then as they were leaving Paris, they got stopped by a wedding party in the streets, which made them take an alternate route that they had never gone down before, and they got lost on their way out of another gate. And then they lost another hour when their carriage broke down and a horse became unharnessed. And on several stops, King Louis insisted on getting out of the carriage to talk to the peasants, letting them know who he was. And Marie Antoinette, clueless as always, gave a bunch of silver plates away to a local official who had given them help. But it was at the town of Varennes, just 20 miles from their destination, where King Louis was feeling peckish and decided to stop at an inn for some brie cheese and a glass of Burgundy. Or so the story goes. Well, not surprisingly, someone recognized them actually a few towns back, and this little pit stop gave him time to catch up, and so the entire royal family was arrested and taken back to Paris. Well, flash forward to January 21st, 1793, and old King Louis gets one last request before his march up to Madame Guillotine. And what does he ask for? A final taste of brie de Meaux. Now that's somewhat ironic, seeing it was the French revolutionary Joseph Lavallee who said, "Brie, loved by the rich and the poor, preached equality before anyone dreamt it possible." But being the last wish of a dying monarch of France wasn't enough for brie. It still had to shine on, and in 1815, it was going to get its chance. It was at the Congress of Vienna where the leaders of Europe decided on a new political order after the fall of Napoleon. The newly restored monarchy was represented by that French Machiavelli, Talleyrand, former Minister of Foreign Affairs under Napoleon. Now the two men were often at odds, and in one public encounter shortly before Talleyrand abandoned Napoleon, the little corporal said of his minister, "You are nothing but shit in a silk stocking." Pardon my French. But it was Talleyrand who got the last laugh, because he was the last line of defense to stop the other European rulers from carving up Napoleon's former empire like a Christmas ham. Now, he held few cards coming off of France's defeat at Waterloo, but that wily old diplomat held one creamy ace up his sleeve: Brie de Meaux. In a display of gastronomic diplomacy, Talleyrand held a lavish dinner where he held a contest to determine the greatest cheese of Europe. Quite literally. Lord Castlereagh nominated English Stilton. Baron de Falk espoused the Dutch Limburger. The Swiss had Gruyere, and Italy Stracchino. 52 cheeses were paraded up and down the table, enjoyed by all. It reminds me of that song that Pinky from Pinky and the Brain sings, "Cheese from around the world." But the last cheese, le dernier fromage, was the Brie de Meaux. And to be frank, there was no contest. The other 51 cheeses never stood a chance. Go home, Parmesan, you're drunk. Brie was crowned le roi de fromage, no longer just the cheese of kings, but the king of cheese. So let us all bow down to the king of cheese and take it out of the oven. So once the tart has set in the middle and browned a bit on top, remove it from the oven and set it on a cooling rack. Now you can wait until it's completely cooled, but I think it's served best a little warm. So we'll cut a little slice here. Based on the ingredients, I have a feeling it's going to be rich, so not too much. Beautiful how it holds together. And here we go. I don't know what I'm tasting. It tastes like brie, but you can also taste definitely a little bit of the kind of the spices in there. But it doesn't feel like brie. It's much denser than brie, which is saying something. But it's good. You know what would be good on this? Oh, I wish I still had some. The râpé that I made last week. I'll put a link in the description down below. It was a fig paste that would have just gone perfectly with this, and I think I still have some fig paste that is commercially bought, and I'm going to put that on that because that would be just delicious. Anyway, links to all the ingredients down in the description, along with the original 14th century recipe and the modernized version I used today. So don't forget to hit the notification bell when you subscribe so I can see you next time on Tasting History. Yes, that fig will work wonders on this. Interesting. Have you ever visited Medieval Times, the restaurant? Now, I love that place. It has everything I want. It has jousting, hawking, little paper crowns, everything. But then my dinner comes. I see there's tomato soup and corn. Both New World ingredients that just would not have been period. But you know what? I'm like, okay, no one else is saying anything, so I'm not gonna be that guy. But then I get my plate, and it's made of pewter. It's not a period trencher. Piece of bread, all the food goes on to soak up the juices. It's a pewter plate, and I just lose it. I stand up, I flip the table, virgin pina coladas and Diet Coke everywhere, and I'm asked to never return to the castle in Buena Park, California. But I calm down, I come home, pour myself a glass of wine, and make my own medieval trencher bread. This time, on Tasting History. Now, there were all sorts of bread made during the Middle Ages. You had your pain de main, which was your fine white bread, the most expensive, and then you had your horse bread, which was essentially made for horses. It was made of ground up peas and old beans and whatever you could sweep up off the floor. Then there was a bread called tort, and it was just above the horse bread. It was made of unbolted flour, basically the whole grain of barley or oat or spelt or any of those really expensive flours that you'd get at Whole Foods today. It was the junk back then. And that was the bread that was usually used to make trenchers. Now, unfortunately, because baking bread was just so ubiquitous back in the day, they didn't bother to write down any recipes. So we have to rely on later recipes from the Renaissance and the work of excellent culinary historians to have a guess at what medieval bread was like. So with that caveat out there, let's go ahead and make a loaf of tort. For this recipe, you'll need 250 grams of whole wheat flour, preferably stone ground, and 250 grams of any other flour. I'm using 125 grams of dark rye and 125 of oat flour. Then add 2.5 teaspoons or 1 packet of dry yeast. Now, I know what you're going to say. Max, dry yeast was not available in the Middle Ages, and I know. But what they would have used as leaveners were either old dough, which is sourdough, which takes a long time to make, and I have some, but I don't want to waste it on bread that you're actually not going to eat, or ale barm, which is very hard to find and very expensive. So I'm using active dry yeast. But I promise, Scout's honor, I think this is how we used to do it, I will make loaves with both ale barm and old dough, or sourdough, in the future, and they will be delicious. So, be on the lookout for that. Now the only other ingredient that you'll need is 2 cups of warm water. What you won't need is salt. Salt was very expensive in the Middle Ages, and they weren't going to waste it on bread that you weren't going to eat. So go ahead and add your water into the flour and begin to knead. Now because of the types of flour that we're using, the kneading process takes forever. I mean, it always takes a long time, but this is really tough. So go ahead and use a stand mixer. I'm not going to judge you, just like you didn't judge me for using the dry yeast, right? Now usually you knead the bread until you get the window pane. You know, you take up a little piece of dough until you can kind of see the light through it. This is probably never going to get there, and that's okay because we actually want it to stay dense. We don't want a huge rise from this bread. So once the dough is worked enough that it's not completely falling apart, put it into a lightly oiled bowl and let it sit for about an hour. During that time, it will rise, but it's not going to double in size. It'll just get puffy on top, and that's good enough. Now while you wait for the dough to rise, it's the perfect time to smash that like button, and I will teach you a little bit about the history of medieval trenches. Trencher comes from the old French word trancher, meaning to slice, because that's essentially what it is. It's just a slice of bread that you're going to put food onto to let it soak up the juices. Then once you're done, you can feed it to the dogs or to the peasants. How'd you do? Whichever's faster. But the history of trenchers goes back way before the Middle Ages. Even in Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas is told a prophecy. Never shall you build your promised city until the injury you did us by this slaughter has brought you to a hunger so cruel that you gnaw your very tables. Later, after a rather meager feast, he realized the prophecy had come true when he saw his men eating their own trenchers. You don't eat trenchers unless you're a dog or a peasant.
Oh, there you go, bringing class into it again.
Now, unless you were a king or an earl or something like that, you didn't have an oven at your house. So how did you make the bread for your trenchers, or the bread that you're going to eat? Sometimes people went to communal ovens, often called the king's oven. But more often than not, like today, you'd get your bread from a baker. And there were a lot of bakers. And that created competition. And they didn't like competition. So in 1266, the bakers of Coventry got together and petitioned King Henry III to create what was essentially the OPEC of bread. It was called the Assize of Bread and Ale. It was a set of laws that remained virtually unchanged for 600 years until the Bread Acts of 1822 and 1836. Now the Assize set the price of a loaf of wastel. Essentially, the price of bread stayed the same no matter what the price of wheat was. What changed was the size of the loaf. For example, when a quarter of wheat is sold at 12 pence, then wastel bread of a farthing, white and well-baked, shall weigh 6 pounds and 16 shillings. But when the same quarter of wheat is sold at 18 pence, then a loaf should weigh 3 pounds, 8 shillings. Now you'll notice that because people didn't usually carry around a standard set of weights, they used coins as both the unit of worth and the unit of weight. It's really confusing. It'd be like saying that this bottle of wine costs $22, 6 nickels, and a penny. But it needs to weigh 14 quarters, 3 dimes, and 7 nickels. Really makes you appreciate standard weights and measurements, doesn't it? Now, like I said, the bread is not going to double in size. But after about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, depending on how warm it is where you are, go ahead and dump the dough out onto your work surface and knock out the air. Then shape it into a round loaf. Now again, the dough is not going to stretch like a normal dough, so make sure you don't tear it as you form your loaf. Then cover the loaf and let it rise for another 20 minutes while you preheat the oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit with a baking sheet already inside. Once the loaf is puffed up a bit, score the top with either a cross or a star and pop it into the oven for about 10 minutes at 450. Then drop the temperature to 375 for another 20 minutes until the loaf is baked through. And there we have it. A loaf of bread ready to make into trenchers. Not so fast. you actually have to wait 3 days or so because the loaf has to get stale. Then you'll slice it, and that is your trencher bread. Now, all of the ingredients and the recipe are listed in the description down below, as well as links to some of the flours I used. If you end up making your own loaf, leave me a comment down below and let me know how it goes. Also, if you have any recipes in mind that you want me to try out, I'm always looking for suggestions. So make sure to like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Oktoberfest, that glorious time of year where thousands of tourists descend upon Munich, Germany, and make drunken fools of themselves while wearing ill-fitted lederhosen. But not this year. Yes, for only the 25th time in 210 years, Oktoberfest ist abgesagt. Cancelled. But I had no plan to go to Munich anyway, so it doesn't really put much of a damper on my plans. Instead, I'm going to be celebrating Oktoberfest here at home by making one of the festival's star snacks, the pretzel. This time on Tasting History. The first Oktoberfest celebration was held in 1810 to honor the marriage of Bavarian Crown Prince Ludwig to the Saxon Hildburghausen Princess Theresa. That year, the main event was a horse race, which became the reason for the yearly celebration. But as time went on, the focus shifted more toward food and beer, so much so that in 1896, what had been little scattered beer stalls were replaced by massive beer halls. The beer then, and still today, has to be brewed in Munich and has to live up to the Reinheitsgebot, or German beer purity law of 1516. Now, I don't know if mine lives up to the Reinheitsgebot, but it's the Oktoberfest Märzen, Polina. Yes! Standards that strictly adhere to the Reinheitsgebot using only 4 ingredients, water, hops, yeast, and malt for nearly 400 years. How's about that? So, I am Reinheitsgebot compliant, even here in California. But regardless if your beer is Reinheitsgebot compliant or not, nothing will accompany it better than a pretzel. And that's what we're making today. Now, today's recipe comes from the 1581 Ein Neu Kochbuch, or A New Cookbook, by Max Rumpolt. Kind of a misleading name now, 440 years later, but I guess it was new when it came out. Anyway, Prezzedella. Take fair flour, egg yolk, and a little wine, sugar and anise, and make a dough with it. With clean hands, roll it nicely long and rounded, and make little pretzels. Place in a warm oven and bake, not burning it, but until they are well dried so they are crisp and good. You may or may not use cinnamon, and it is called Prezzedella. Now, this is going to be very different from the traditional Bavarian pretzel that we're used to that would be served at Oktoberfest today. First of all, it's not going to be soft and springy because it's not leavened. It's going to be probably more like a cookie or a biscuit and crumbly. In fact, the recipe even said that it should be crisp after baking. Also, it has some really interesting ingredients like anise and cinnamon, if you want, and wine. I mean, that's just weird. Clearly, I did not think this through because I just opened this beer and now I'm about to open a bottle of wine as well, and I'm going to have both to contend with. But in the words of Heinrich Heine, ich grolle nicht. I shan't complain. Now on with the recipe. What you'll need is 2½ cups or 300 grams of flour, 4 to 5 large egg yolks, 1/3 cup or 80 milliliters of wine. Now, the recipe doesn't specify what kind of wine. I would probably steer away from a red wine. I'd go with a white. I went with a Riesling that's actually, it's not too sweet, but it is sweeter than most of your white wines. So, because it's supposed to be a sweet dish, but go with whatever you want. 3/4 cup or 150 grams of sugar, a ½ teaspoon ground aniseed, a ½ teaspoon ground cinnamon. Now, that's optional according to the recipe, and a ½ teaspoon of salt. Now, some of you are probably saying, but Max, where is the lie? And 'tis no lie, there is no lie in this pretzel. Now, the pretzels that we think of today, and the ones that would actually be served at Oktoberfest, are called Laugenbrezeln, or lye pretzels, and that's because they're dipped in a diluted but still caustic lye solution before being baked. And that's what gives it the wonderful dark color and that sheen on the outside, as well as contributes to the taste. But for all that we know, they haven't changed in hundreds of years. It's a very simple recipe, and they really haven't changed. So, seeing as this is all about making historic foods and tasting something a little different, I figured if you want to see what a Laugenbrezeln tasted like 200 years ago, just go get one today, so I'm going with a recipe from Mainz, Germany, just up the road, like 100 miles I think, for the Brezeldella, or the sweeter pretzels. So the first thing to do is preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 180 degrees Celsius. Then add your flour to a medium bowl and whisk in the aniseed, cinnamon, and salt. Then, in a separate bowl, beat the eggs and sugar until they are as pale as I am in the middle of winter. Then add in the wine and mix until incorporated. Finally, a third at a time, add in the dry ingredients and mix in gently just until there are no streaks remaining. At this point, the dough should be fairly workable. Now, if it's too sticky to work with, just add a little bit more flour, 1 tablespoon at a time, until it becomes a consistency that you think you're going to be able to roll into pretzels. Then, with clean hands, per the recipe's instructions, take a piece of dough and roll it out until it's a nice long rope. Now, the recipe is not specific in how thin to roll the dough, but I can tell you right now, because we didn't work any gluten, there's not going to be a lot of stretch to this dough, so it will break if you get it too thin. So just kind of play with it, but not too thin. Once the dough is rolled out though, it's time to shape your pretzels. Again, the recipe is not specific in how big the pretzels are going to be. It says little pretzels, but is that big? Who knows? You know, a Laugen pretzel can be like this big, so anything is smaller than that. But I ended up making about 6 or 7, I think I made like 6 decent-sized pretzels with this, simply because any thinner and my dough broke. So take the rope of dough and form a U shape. Then cross one end over the other and give it one more little twist. Then make sure the main part of the pretzel is nice and round. Then fold the twisted ends over and press the tips down very gently. Then place it onto a lined baking sheet and repeat. Now, these pretzels are going to turn out with a dull finish, and that's okay. But if you want to add an egg wash using egg yolk at this point, go right ahead. It'll give them a little bit of a sheen. It just looks nicer, and egg is already in the recipe, so it's not going to affect the flavor at all. Now, once the Brezeldella are shaped, pop them in the oven for 12 to 15 minutes while we look at the history of pretzels. So the story goes that in the year 610, an Italian monk was teaching little children how to say their prayers for Lent. And when they would do well, he would give them a little treat. It was a piece of bread that he would roll and twist into the shape. It was supposed to be the shape of the children's arms folded over as if they were praying. And he called them little rewards, or pretiola. Wonderful story, so sweet, so nice, so probably not true. First of all, while not impossible, the very specific date of 610 AD makes me a little dubious of this story, because in the 7th century, monks were writing down, weddings of royalty or the death of a king or chronicling a battle, but they weren't writing down the creation of a bread product very often. So that very specific date makes me a little dubious. Also, there are places in southern France that claim the exact same story or something very similar, and in Germany they claim they made them and named them bracelos, which means bracelet in Latin. So, yeah. And more recently, historians believe that the twisted bread was actually probably around as far back as when the Celts were still in Central Europe. And then the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages just took them and gave them a nice little backstory. The medieval Catholic Church taking pagan things and converting them to fit into Christianity? Doesn't seem like something they would have done, but I suppose it's possible. But regardless of where pretzels got their start, we do know that they were quite popular in and around modern-day Germany by the 12th century, where in 1111 they began to appear on the emblems of bakers' guilds. Then in 1185 we have the earliest depiction of the knotted baked good in an Alsatian encyclopedia called the Hortus Deliciarum, or Garden of Delights. A document more notable for being the first encyclopedia compiled by a woman, Herad of Landsberg. What's interesting to me is the rather anachronistic placement of the pretzel in Herod's work, where it's sitting on Queen Esther's dinner table from the Bible. And while this may be the bread's first official link to religious symbolism, it is just the beginning of pretzels getting all knotted up with Christianity. See, while there is no direct evidence for that lovely monk-making pretzel story, we do know that by the Middle Ages, pretzels had become very popular as a Lenten food, or a food served during Lent, because they were so simple. It was just flour, salt, water, and sometimes yeast and sometimes not. It was a perfect dish for those 40 days of fasting before Easter. Additionally, the fact that its distinct shape left 3 holes in one pretzel made for an easy way for the medieval church to describe that Holy Trinity, which they were always having trouble explaining to people. Most famously, St. Patrick likened it to the 3 leaves on a single clover, though I think that I prefer the pretzel analogy. And it seems that the Catholic Church was actually a really good publicist for pretzels, because other than giving them a really cool origin story, they also began splashing them all over the pages of prayer books, where St. Bartholomew was often depicted surrounded by a wreath of pretzels. Saint or no, that man loved his carbs. And it's probably those religious tie-ins that helped pretzels make their way into the holiday traditions of many German-speaking countries. At Christmas, people would dangle them from their Tannenbaum like tasteful ornaments, and then at New Year's, children would hang them around their necks as a good luck charm, something that's still practiced in parts of Germany today. And by Easter, parents were hiding pretzels in and around the house, kind of as a sort of pre-Easter egg hunt tradition. And frankly, I think I would prefer pretzels to hard-boiled eggs. Though I do wonder if they were trying to use the same pretzels for all 3 holidays, because I don't really think those Christmas pretzels are going to make it to Easter. But it wasn't all fun and games for pretzels. They played their part in some very serious historical events as well. Namely, in 1529, when the city of Vienna, Austria was under siege by the Ottomans led by Suleiman the Magnificent. So the story goes that the Ottomans were digging tunnels to undermine the city's walls, but some monks who were in the basement of their monastery baking pretzels heard the scratching of the pickaxes. They raised the alarm and alerted the famous Imperial Landsknechte, who stopped the enemy before they could break through, saving the city. And as a reward, the pretzel-baking monks were given an official coat of arms by the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. Wonderful story, but also probably not true. But I don't really mind that, because while it's probably not true, it's surrounded by true events. And that's one thing that I love about these little stories in history. I go searching for pretzel history, and instead I spend 4 hours learning about the Siege of Vienna, which I didn't know that much about. And I love that I can just kind of fall down these little historical rabbit holes. And that is why I am so proud to be sponsored today by CuriosityStream, a never-ending rabbit hole of learning. CuriosityStream allows you to stream thousands of documentaries on everything from nature to travel, technology, and of course, food and history. You can watch on your phone or your smart TV or on your computer, as I used to do back at my old job, where I always had CuriosityStream playing on one of my monitors. Not that I encourage that sort of behavior while you're at work. $14.99. That's only about 200 years before the pretzel made its way to America. Now, we don't have an exact year for pretzel's debut in the New World, but it was probably around the year 1700 when an influx of German immigrants came in to settle Pennsylvania. But pretzels basically stayed the same until 1861, when they got a new twist. Julius Sturgis in Lititz, Pennsylvania opened America's first commercial pretzel bakery. Soon after, he developed the American hard pretzel, and they were great because they lasted a lot longer and he could ship them further away. Now, many people give him full credit for having the first hard pretzel, but as we've seen in our recipe today, that is not quite so, because our pretzel should be nice and crisp and about ready to take out of the oven. So start checking your pretzels around 12 minutes, but it might take a little bit longer. You just want to have them kind of dried out on top and browning just a little bit around the edges. Then take them out and set them on a wire rack to cool. And here we are, our 16th century Brezeln Pretzedella. So yeah, here it is. It's lovely. I actually ended up doing the egg wash on some and not on others. I definitely like the egg wash. I also sprinkled a little extra cinnamon on top just because it looked good, and why not? I'd say that's crispy. Let's give it a shot. They're also kind of crumbly though, so. These pretzels are making me thirsty. Seinfeld shout out for anyone who watches Seinfeld. All right, so full transparency here. I'm not really a fan, namely because they have aniseed in them. I don't like aniseed, so why would I think I would be a fan? I need a lot more sugar. I just don't like that flavor all that much. And it's not like overwhelmingly anise flavored. There's that flavor, and I just don't really care for that. The texture is interesting. It's almost like shortbread, except a little softer. Like they don't crumble quite as much as shortbread. But the texture actually I don't mind, though they did make me thirsty, legitimately. I do think that if I was going to make these, I would just leave out the aniseed and put maybe some extra sugar and maybe ginger in them, and then they would be delicious. So, I think that you can play around and do some different flavors. But other than the shape of a pretzel, there's nothing about this that screams pretzel in the flavor. But if you think about like those Dutch butter cookies that are in pretzel shape, there's nothing about that says pretzel other than shape either. So really, it's just the shape, and that's okay, because it was fun to make it. I learned how to do that. I'd never done it before, and it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. Anyway, regardless of what you're doing for Oktoberfest, I hope that you have a beer, have a pretzel, or just enjoy Oktoberfest however you like, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Gingerbread is perhaps my favorite thing to eat during the holidays, and so, running Food History Channel, I decided to look into the history of gingerbread. And what I found out shook me to my core. It got me all verklempt. I'm going to give you a topic. Early gingerbread was neither ginger nor bread. Discuss! Okay, I'm sorry about that. Regardless of early gingerbread sometimes not being anything like what we eat today, I decided, nevertheless, to make my own medieval gingerbread. This time on Tasting History. Now you might notice that today is not my usual posting day. Usually it's on Tuesdays. But when the channel How to Make Everything reached out and let me know that they were making a mortar and pestle from scratch in the way that it would have been done in ye olden days, and wondered if I wanted to use it in a recipe, I kinda had to jump at the chance. That's why I decided to go for gingerbread, which has a lot of spices to grind. Really take this puppy for a test drive. So as I mentioned, I'm doing gingerbread, but today's gingerbread ain't your mother's gingerbread. Though, unlike some medieval recipes, at least this one does contain ginger. To make gingerbread, take good honey and clarify it on the fire, and take fair pandeman or wastel bread and grate it, and cast it into the boiling honey, and stir it well together fast with a sklies, that it burn not to the vessel. And then take it down and put therein ginger, long pepper, and saunders, and temper it up with thin hands. And then put them to a flat boist, and straw thereon sugar, and pick therein cloves round about by the edge, and in the mids, if it please you, etc. So I left that original spelling because 90% of those words, I think that we can kind of figure out what they mean, and any that weren't, obvious, I put in parentheses to give you a bit of a guide. Anyway, this medieval gingerbread recipe from the 14th century sounds more like it's going to be confectionery or almost candy-like than bread-like. Quite a far cry from what we know as gingerbread today, especially that kind of soft, cakey gingerbread that I love so much. Interesting thing about that gingerbread is that one of the very first recipes for that soft gingerbread actually came from Amelia Simmons' American Cookery from 1796. And you may remember that that is the same book that has one of the first recipes for a custardy pumpkin pie like we know today. So I guess we owe a lot to Miss Amelia Simmons for holiday baking. But as for our medieval gingerbread, what you'll need is 1 cup or 330 grams of honey, 1/2 loaf or 250 grams of white bread. A note about both of these ingredients, don't feel like you have to stick right to those exact amounts because it's going to vary depending on what kind of bread you use and how dry it is. And it does need to be really very dry because we're going to make breadcrumbs out of it. If you don't want to make breadcrumbs, then you can just buy breadcrumbs and those will work as well. 1 tablespoon dried ginger, 3/4 teaspoon long pepper, a 1/2 teaspoon sandalwood. And a note on all 3 of those ingredients, those amounts again, you can change up. I really want a strong ginger flavor, so I'm using quite a bit of ginger. But if you want something a little bit more peppery, then, change those amounts. There is no rule, the recipe is not specific, so it's really up to you. As for the saunders or sandalwood, it's hard to find. It doesn't really add much flavor. And so if you want, you can just add some red food coloring to kind of give it a red tint. But even that, you don't have to do, so you can feel free to leave it out. It's not going to make much of a difference when it comes to taste. 1/4 cup or even less of sugar. It's just enough to sprinkle on the top. And several whole cloves for decoration. You can also use some gold leaf for this recipe. Again, you don't have to, it's not mentioned in the recipe, but it is known that in medieval times they often would bedight their gingerbread with gold leaf, just to make it pretty. It actually led to the English phrase, "take the gilt off the gingerbread." So I'm going to be using just a little bit because I do think it's pretty. So first things first, let's put our mortar and pestle to use. So break up the bread with your hands into large breadcrumbs, and then using a mortar and pestle, grind them into fine breadcrumbs. Then grind your dried ginger and your long pepper. So the ginger actually ground up really easily. It took me like a minute or two, which is pretty great. The long pepper, less easy, has less to do with the mortar and pestle, I think, and the fact that pepper is just hard to grind, and that's one reason why they have the pepper grinders at restaurants rather than a mortar and pestle at the table. Once everything is ground up, pour the honey into a saucepan and set it over medium heat until it's boiling. Now you may recall, if you watched my video on mead, there was a word in the recipe, leng, which I had trouble finding a definite definition, and I actually had some wonderful linguists reach out to me with ideas of where it could have come from, and all fascinating, but nothing was definitive. Then I'm reading this recipe from about 200 years later, not even 100 years later, and the word boiling is spelled the same way, at least the leng part. So I'm curious if leng ended up meaning boiling, or was just a shortened version, which would have made sense in that original video. I think that is just, I think it's so interesting etymologically, which is probably why I don't get invited to a lot of dinner parties. Now when it comes to the honey, most honey that you're going to be buying is already clarified, so you're not going to have to skim anything off the top. If you are using unclarified honey, then there might be some things at the top that you need to skim off, so go ahead and skim those now. Then, once it's boiling, add in your breadcrumbs until you get a nice homogeneous mixture. So here's where you need to be a little bit flexible with the ingredients because the amount of breadcrumbs that you're going to add can vary. So I would add just a bit at a time. I actually probably added too many at once, but you can add just a bit at a time, and you just want it to kind of come away from the sides of the pot. That's the consistency you're looking for. You can always add more. You can also always add more honey. Even if it's not boiling, it's fine, because it's fine. Then turn off the heat and stir in your spices. Now it's going to be hot, but you can go ahead and taste a little bit at this time to see if you want to add some more spices. Then take the mixture out of the pan and put it onto a sheet of parchment. Then roll it out until it's nice and smooth. At this point, you want to let it firm up for a few hours or even overnight, which should give us plenty of time to see how this gingerbread became this gingerbread. They brought him first the sweet wine, and mead also in a maslin, and royal spicery of gingerbread that was full fine, and licorice, and also cumin, with sugar that is so nice. Now that was from Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, written around the same time as our recipe, and it lets us see that this was not a treat for the masses, but rather an opulent item worthy of the royal spicery. And while not always necessarily royal, gingerbread and other spiced breads had definitely been a luxury item since their introduction to Europe. According to legend, in 992, the Armenian monk Gregory of Nicopolis brought a honey and spice treat possibly similar to those that had been eaten in ancient Rome and even ancient Greece to Bonderoy, France, where his guests on tasting the cake believed they were experiencing all the delights of heaven. But what Gregory brought probably didn't actually have any ginger in it, but was what the French would later call pain d'épices, or spice bread. But ginger or no, spiced cakes began cropping up all over Northern Europe. Pfefferkuchen, or pepper cake, in Germany, which oddly enough didn't have any pepper in it, or pierniki trunski, or Torun gingerbread from Poland, which did contain ginger and is first mentioned as being baked in 1380, around the same time as our recipe from England. Now before that, in the 13th century, the monks of Nuremberg began creating a baked good called Lebkuchen. And they took this cake so seriously that in the 15th century, they established a guild to regulate its production. Essentially, other than Christmas and Easter, nobody was allowed to make this cake except for the bakers in the guild. And according to legend, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III, in an effort to bolster his popularity, had 4,000 Lebkuchen molded in his likeness for the children of the city. Following Frederick's foray into propagandistic baked goods, Queen Elizabeth I herself decided to dabble in the power of the gingerbread man. Supposedly, at one of these grand feasts that the Virgin Queen held, she had baked a collection of gingerbread men and perhaps gingerbread women, all in the likeness of her courtiers and visiting dignitaries. Now, we don't know a lot about why exactly she did this or how well it was received, but I like to imagine that it was Elizabeth's way of telling people what she thought of them at any given time. Here is your gingerbread likeness, Lady Knowles. It really catches your beauty. And Sir Walter Raleigh. The resemblance is uncanny. Queen Elizabeth was not the only Elizabethan enamored with gingerbread, for at the same time, William Shakespeare wrote, "And had I but 1 penny in the world, thou shouldst have it to buy gingerbread." So by now you could buy gingerbread for just a penny, which actually, while still rather expensive for what it is in the reach of much more of the population. So it's no wonder that around this time we start seeing gingerbread cropping up in a lot of the recipe books for the average wealthy household. And small versions that were kind of like modern ginger biscuits were actually being sold at fairs all around Britain. And still to this day in Cornwall, something called a fairing is basically a little ginger biscuit. But to see gingerbread really come into its artistic own, we have to go back over to the continent for gingerbread and springerlemolds. Now used on all sorts of spiced breads, the origin of these intricately carved wooden molds is up for some debate. Some say Torun, Poland, some say Swabia, Germany, but regardless of where they came from, they are absolutely beautiful works of art and can often be as large as 3 feet tall. I have always wanted one of these antique molds that you can get, so maybe by next Christmas, I'll have one and I'll use it in a video. That's my 2021 goal. Now, there is a 12th century French poem that translates to the land of cocaine, nothing to do with its unfortunate modern homonym. Instead, it was this kind of mythical medieval land of plenty and opulent foods that crops up all through art and literature through the Middle Ages. And in this poem, a peasant is dreaming of a land where the houses were made of barley sugar and cakes, the streets were paved with pastry. Sounds just delightful. So 700 years after this poem, 2 brothers decided to retell the story in a sort of fairy tale called Das Märchen vom Schlaraffenland. And perhaps it was one of these houses made of cake that inspired another fairy tale that these 2 wrote about a non-child-friendly cannibalistic witch. Not very Christmassy, you say, but the Grimm brothers' fairy tale, Hansel and Gretel, started a tradition of decorating gingerbread houses around Christmas time that flourished throughout Germany, Europe, and even in the Americas all through the 19th century. Now I can tell you that our medieval gingerbread's consistency is not going to make for a very good gingerbread house, but as Paul Hollywood always says on the Great British Bake Off whenever they're making gingerbread houses, it all comes down to taste. So once your gingerbread is cooled and firmed up a bit, go ahead and straw or scatter a bit of sugar over the top. The amount is really up to you. Now at this point, you can cut it up however you want. I ended up just doing little squares, but you could use cookie cutters or even have some sort of stamp and imprint something on it. It should be soft enough to do so. Then you can go ahead and decorate it with the cloves and or the gold leaf if you want. So here we are, medieval gingerbread. Now the interesting thing with the clove is, I'm guessing people weren't eating full cloves because that's odd, but just putting the clove in there for a few minutes, I'm thinking it's going to give it quite a bit of flavor because I can smell it really coming through. It doesn't take much. Clove is really, really strong. So let's give this a try. The nice thing is, if there's any gold on it, you can actually eat that. It is edible. Let's have a go. They're candy-like. It's a little grittier than I might like. Lots of ginger, which is what I want. Really nice, really comes through. There's a little burn there at the end because I use that dried ginger that I ground up. If you like ginger, these are a wonderful little candy, because that's what they are. They're really more like almost like a gummy candy, but they're really nice. I wouldn't equate it with gingerbread though. So one thing I wanted to mention is that Tasting History now has a Discord. So I'm putting a link in the description. If you're on Discord and want to talk more about food and history, or other things like cats and Pokemon, go ahead and join our Tasting History Discord. So thank you again to the team over at How to Make Everything for sending me the wonderful mortar and pestle, which gave me the impetus to do this additional video this Christmas season. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. It's the 1-year anniversary of Tasting History, and so I was thinking we need to do a dish with some spectacle. And luckily for us, history is filled with spectacular dishes that are spectacular just for the sake of being spectacular. Word of caution, if you have a delicate constitution, consider this your warning about today's recipe, because today we are making the spectacular and legendary cockatrice, a half-pig, half-bird creature of myth found on the banquet tables of medieval and Tudor England. So if you are still with me after that, wish me luck in honing my surgical skills, this time on Tasting History. So to be quite frank, I never actually thought that I would make this recipe. It kind of seemed like a bit of a bridge too far, even for me, but I did have a weird curiosity about it after researching it for the video on capons that I did back at the very early days of Tasting History. And so, after a few cocktails I'm sure, I did decide that for the 1-year anniversary, I would make this dish, which is very likely to make me into a vegetarian. Now, the earliest recipe I could actually find for this comes from the form of curry in the 14th century, one of my favorite sources. But it's actually for the coq gris, so it's an earlier form of the word. It's a portmanteau of coq, meaning capon, and gris, meaning small pig from the Old Norse. Now, I have no actual proof of this, but I figured that it was also a play on the word cockatrice, which was a mythical dragon or serpent-like beast with the head of a rooster. Just makes sense. It can't be a coincidence that the words are so close to each other and mean two animals like made into a new one. Just can't be a coincidence. There are also two 15th century manuscripts for the same dish but spelled cockatrice or cockatrice. And basically all three dishes are the same except for minor variations, especially in what they're stuffed with. For my part, I'm going to be using the 15th century Douce Manuscript 55 because it is the most complete cockatrice. Scald a capon clean and cut him in two at the waist, and scald a pig and drain him, and cut him in the same manner. And then sew the fore part of the pig and the hind part of the capon together. Then mix the white and the yolks of egg, and cast thereto, and suet of a sheep, and saffron, and salt, and powder of ginger, and grated bread. And mix all together with your hands, and put it in the cockatrice, and put it on a spit, and roast him. And endure him with yolks of egg, and powder of ginger, and saffron, and juice of parsley or mallow. And clean him, and endure him in every part of him. Now, all three recipes actually call for you to make two cockatrices. You would take the front half of the capon and the back half of the pig and make another one, so you're not wasting anything. I don't need to have two of those, plus my capon doesn't actually have a head or anything, because you can't buy them that way mostly these days, if you can even find a capon, which I did. But I am saving the other two halves and will probably put them on the smoker, so they will be used. So for the two main ingredients, you need the front half of a suckling pig, 15 to 20 pounds, and the back half of a capon, or a small turkey will also work if you can't find a capon. Also, I would really ask the butcher to cut these in half for you, because it's not going to be easy otherwise. For the amounts of the filling, it really depends on the size of the pig, so here is a general outline. 20 to 30 eggs, 2 cups of suet, a large pinch of saffron, 1.5 to 2 tablespoons of salt, 1 tablespoon of ground ginger, and 2 or 3 loaves of stale bread. I'd use something that has a little bit of flavor to it. Don't just get white bread, even though that was probably the most fancy back then, manchet bread, but it's going to have the least amount of flavor. Now at the end of the recipe, it says that you endure the cockatrice, and that means to color gold, which was an extremely popular thing to do in the Middle Ages. And for that, you'll need 2 dozen egg yolks, 2 tablespoons of ginger, a large pinch of saffron, and a bunch of parsley turned into juice. It is painstaking to turn parsley into juice. Probably easier if I had a juicer, but I don't. So you shouldn't need to scald and drain the animals because that should have been taken care of by the butcher and the poulterer, but you do want to make sure that they are clean and spotless inside and out. And then let the sewing commence. It actually was not as hard as I thought it was. I used surgical sutures because I figured that would be the easiest and cleanest way to do it, and it worked like a GIF, but I would never do it again. Then beat your eggs and add in the ginger, salt, saffron, and the suet. Then break up your bread into breadcrumbs and add the egg mixture. Then mix it together with your hands just as the recipe commands. Then stuff the stuffing into the cockatrice and sew up the belly. Then if you have a spit at home, that's what you're supposed to use, but I don't have a spit. I have a tiny kitchen and I live in a condo, so I used a roasting pan and put it in the oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit or 150 degrees Celsius for about 3.5 hours. Now, the length that you cook it actually kind of depends on the size of what you're cooking, but you want a thermometer stuck into the middle of the stuffing to be 165 degrees Fahrenheit or 74 degrees Celsius. So what's interesting is that these two meats, the pig and the capon, they're going to cook at different rates. So I actually ended up tenting the back of the capon just so it wouldn't dry out too much near the end of the cooking process, but you have to remember that this dish was not so much about the actual flavor, it was about the look of it, so they didn't really care. Now once you get close to that internal temperature, kick up the heat to 450 Fahrenheit or 230 Celsius just to let the skin crisp for about 10 minutes. Now while our cochintrice roasts in the oven, I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much for watching and supporting Tasting History over the past year. It turned what was a really horrible event, my getting furloughed, into one of the most amazing years of my life. So thank you. Whether you were there at the very beginning with medieval cheese, or you joined me with garum or melasomos, or today with the cochintrice, if that's your first dish, and I kind of worry if it is, but thank you. Thank you so much. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the history of Tasting History this year, because there is a lot of it, but we have started a secondary channel called Catch Up with Max, where we basically do go into each episode and kind of get more into the details and answer questions that I didn't answer in the episode, and talk about, other things that have gone on during this astounding year. And speaking of astounding, let's talk about some other astounding dishes from history. Now for most of us, food is for eating, but at certain times in history, there have been certain dishes that have come along where eating was really secondary to there being a spectacle. Acts of comestible theater, if you will. Think of the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. That was real. They actually made pies where there would be live birds that would come out of them. Now I don't think that anyone was actually eating the pie, I hope not, because how you train birds to, hold their bladder and other things that entire time, I don't think they did, so I wouldn't eat that pie. No, thank you though. I was gonna hold out for the apple pie. There are no birds in the apple pie, right? Now when it comes to the cochintrice, it really just played one role in a complete cast of crudely concocted chimera. See, medieval and Tudor chefs loved creating new creatures out of old animals. Not sure why. There are stories about adding wings to cows and having entire table-length creatures made of different sections of other animals, kind of like our cochintrice on steroids. I mean, this was a time when they would refeather an entire peacock before putting it out to eat, or they would put an entire cooked dolphin, the whole thing, on the table. Crazy! And in the 14th century cookbook, Blvd du Tavon, there is a dish called the coq sommé, or helmeted cock. It was basically a roasted bird riding astride a roasted pig, and the bird needs a helmet of paper and a lance couched at its breast, and this should be covered in gold and silver leaf for lords. Actually, the form of curry version of the cochintrice recipe has it covered in gold foil at the end, which is why I didn't choose that recipe, because I'm not going to start a Kickstarter to do a dish. Now another way that they used food as theater were through the ironically named subtleties, which I go into detail about in the episode on sugar. These were elaborate sculptures made of almond paste or sugar, an extremely expensive ingredient at the time. It would be like having an ice sculpture now if water cost $100 a gallon. In 1527, Cardinal Wolsey, who you'll know if you ever watched The Tudors, held a feast to impress the French ambassador. Anon came up the second course with so many dishes, subtleties, and curious devices, which were above 100 in number, of so goodly portion and costly that I suppose the Frenchmen never saw the like. There were castles, Paul's church and steeple. There were beasts, birds, fowls of divers kinds, and personages, some fighting as it were with swords, some with guns and crossbows, some dancing with ladies, and with many more devices than I am able with my wit to describe. I really can't tell if that's a humble brag at the end. Even my wit can't describe these things. If it is, I'm stealing it. Now this idea of using food as theater is of course not limited to medieval and Renaissance Europe. Apicius talks at length about the fanciful foods at some ancient Roman feasts, things like flamingo tongue and honeyed dormouse. And in feudal Japan, banquets where each dish was a work of art meant to be coupled with an actual song or an act of drama were commonplace for the elite. Though I think that one of my favorite historic dishes that was ostentatious to the point of really not being a realistic dish to make is the rôti sans pareil, or roast without equal. It came from the mind of Alexandre Balthazar Laurent Grimond de la Reynière. Even his name was over the top. I just love this guy. He's a little bit crazy. He was one of the first published food writers, but he was talking about the food scene in early 19th century France, in l'Almanach des Gourmands. Tangent here, I think my favorite story about Grimond is actually about his funeral. It was 1812, and people were invited to his funeral on the day that it was happening. When they showed up, there was a hearse outside and a coffin laid out on the table, the dinner table. Everybody sits down, a little confused, and then out comes Grimond, and he says, "Dinner is served." See, he just wanted to see who would actually show up to his funeral, especially if it took place during dinner time. Now, we don't know what was served at this funereal meal, but we can guess that it was probably not this rôti sans pareil, roast without equal. The roast without equal is called an angustration, and that is where a bird, or any animal actually, is cooked inside of another animal, like the turducken, though the turducken is 3 birds, turkey, duck, chicken. The roast without equal is 17. You take a caper and an anchovy and put that into a warbler, then wrap that in an ortolan bunting, then squish that inside of a lark. That gets stuffed into a thrush, which is inside of a quail, which is cloaked in a lapwing. That all gets enveloped by a plover, which is jammed inside of a partridge. And then put this partridge in the body of a young woodcock, tender like Mademoiselle Volnay, succulent and well kept. Classy guy. I'm sure Mademoiselle Volnay really appreciated being included in his recipe. Now, your succulent woodcock is then sheathed inside of a teal, which is packed within a guinea fowl. Swaddle that inside of a duck and immerse him in the belly of a hen. The hen you stuff inside of a pheasant, who is bundled up inside of a goose. And then this, the most swollen goose that ever was, is put inside of a turkey, which is wrapped in a bustard. In between each bird, there are layers of bacon and chestnuts and ground meat, and then everything is stewed with fresh herbs and vegetables. Just a nice light dish for a quiet evening at home. Never making that, by the way, so don't even ask. I don't even think I could find like 14 of those birds. The cockatrice is as far as I go. Now, there is one bird in that dish that has its own fantastic history of how it is spectacularly eaten, and that is the ortolan bunting. Now, eating this bird is actually illegal in most places, and where it is legal, it is strictly controlled. And the way that it's eaten, typically, is that it lives its life in a very dark cage where it feasts on millet, and then it is drowned in fine armagnac. Then the bird is plucked and roasted and eaten whole. And the act of eating this bird is considered so shameful and so decadent that the person eating is supposed to wear a napkin over their face to hide their shame from God. Dramatic simply for the sake of being dramatic. And you could kind of say the same thing about our cockatrice, which should be about ready to endure. So first, whisk your egg yolks and add in the saffron, the parsley juice, and the ginger, and whisk everything together. So after that 10 or 15 minutes at the raised temperature, he should be nice and crispy, so take him out and brush him with the egg yolk mixture. Then put him back in the oven for a minute or 2, and then repeat 3 or 4 times or until he's nice and golden. And here we are, the legendary cockatrice. As you can see, I had a bit of trouble cutting into him, but eventually I got what I needed. So let's give the pork a try first. Very saffrony. The pork is good. I mean, it tastes like pork. I've had roast pig before, and that's what it tastes like, though, with more saffron. Now the capon. There's a bit of the white meat, I think. Yeah, it's not dry. Shocking. Definitely gamier than a typical chicken. And I actually like that. I like a gamey flavor. It's good. Quite good. Let me try some of the stuffing. I really like the stuffing. The stuffing is actually my favorite part, which is kind of horrible. They're all very good. I mean, considering what it is, it's actually very simple. It's basically ham and chicken. There's nothing weird about it. It's something that you would eat today. It's just put together in a very unorthodox manner. But it's tasty. But in all honesty, don't ever make this dish. Just get a ham, get a chicken, you're fine. I mean, I'm glad that I did it for the sake of history, but it shouldn't be done again. It shouldn't be done again. So that is the 1-year anniversary dish of Tasting History. Let me know in the comments what your favorite episodes this year have been. We've got some really cool stuff coming up. Got some Egyptian recipes, ancient Egyptian, Japanese, trying to really get outside of Europe, though of course, lots more European and American dishes as well. Also, I am really getting to work on the cookbook as I just signed a deal with Simon & Schuster to have a cookbook come out next year. So thank you again for watching Tasting History. Make sure to subscribe, like this video, and subscribe to Catch Up with Max. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. Lasagna, Garfield's favorite dish of layered pasta stuffed with meaty tomato sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese, right? Well, sometimes. Turns out lasagna is one of the most complicated and varied dishes I've ever researched for this show. And the only way I could figure out how to discuss it was with this, the lasagna family tree. So today I'll show you how to make a medieval lasagna as I tumble down the rabbit hole and explore the genealogy of lasagna, this time on Tasting History. Today is kind of special because I'm getting to pair with the fantastic Chef Frank Proto from his channel, Proto Cooks. You might know Chef Frank for his fantastic 4 levels videos that he does for Epicurious. So on Tasting History today, normal episode talking about the history of lasagna, but then I'm actually going to appear over on Chef Frank's channel afterward to talk about the more recent past of lasagna while he makes his version of an American lasagna. So for today's recipe, we're going to that exact place that you think of when you think of lasagna, medieval England. That's right, we have a recipe for Lausanne in that 14th century cookbook that's become rather perennial on this show, The Form of Curry. Take good broth and cook in an earthen pot. Take fine white flour and make thereof paste with water. And make thereof foils thin as paper with a roller, dry it hard, and boil it in broth. Take Rouen cheese, grated, and lay it in a dish with powdered douce, and lay thereon the foils large and many as thou might, and above powder and cheese, and so twice or thrice, and serve it forth. So a couple of interesting ingredients in there. First, Rouen cheese. We don't really know what it was, lots of speculation, but it was probably a semi-soft cheese made during the autumn. I'm going to be using Gouda. It grates well, and I like Gouda, and it would have been available at the time, but you can go ahead and really use whatever cheese you want. Also, the Gouda that I'm using is rather expensive, so I wanted to take this opportunity to doff my, once again, non-existent history cap and thank the Deans of the Larder, my Patreon patrons who help me to afford all of the lavish ingredients that I use here on Tasting History. The second interesting ingredient is powder douce, and in medieval times there were lots of different spice mixtures going around, but the main ones were powder douce and powder four. Powder douce was definitely sweeter, and powder four was more peppery or spicy, what we think of as spicy. And they would have varied depending on who was actually doing the cooking. There wasn't a standard recipe, but I've used some old recipes to kind of come up with my version of powder douce. Now, even though this dish is English and not Italian, I figure it's close enough to Italian that I've decided to open up a bottle of Montepulciano and enjoy a glass of wine while I rattle off the recipe for you. What you'll need is 2 cups of bread flour, 1/2 cup of water, 1.5 quarts or 1.5 liters of meat stock, beef or chicken, 8 ounces of semi-soft cheese, 1 tablespoon of sugar, 2 teaspoons of ginger, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon nutmeg, 1/2 teaspoon grains of paradise. Now you'll notice that even though it's usually considered sweet, I am adding in some grains of paradise into my powder douce, but I am going to listen to that 13th century Franciscan friar Jacopone da Tori when he said, "He who looks at magnitude is often mistaken. A grain of pepper conquers lasagna with its strength." So to give our lasagna a fighting chance, I'm only adding a little bit of grains of paradise. So the first thing to do is to assemble your powder douce by grinding up any of the spices you might have and mixing them together. Then bottle it up and set it aside. Now we make our noodles. So pour your flour out onto a clean work surface and create a bit of a ring. Then slowly pour the water and work it into the flour. The consistency is going to be quite different from a modern pasta noodle, which is usually made with semolina flour and egg. This is actually going to be more like an unyeasted bread dough. So once the water is incorporated, get to kneading just as you would if you were making a loaf of bread. About 15 minutes by hand, or about half that long if you're going to use a stand mixer. Then cover it and let it rest for 20 minutes. Once that 20 minutes is over, it's time to roll your noodles. Now, if you don't have a huge space to roll, go ahead and divide the dough in half. That's what I had to do. You could even do it in thirds, but you could also do it in one. It's up to you. Now we want these noodles extremely thin, so once you think you've rolled enough, just keep rolling.
Rollin', 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 keep them noodles rollin'. Rollin', 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 lasagna.
Now if you do have a fancy pasta roller, you can go ahead and use it. You'll actually get to see one of those over on Chef Frank's channel when he makes his lasagna, but I did it by hand, like the recipe said. So now that our pasta is rolled, you can go ahead and cut it pretty much to whatever size you want. You can cut it into long strips or even big sheets, or as one 14th century cookbook recommends, into squares 3 fingers wide. And that's going to be 1, easier to boil, and 2, easier to eat because they didn't use forks in medieval Europe at this point, so it was going to actually be eaten with a stick or with your hands. And a big sheet of pasta is just not gonna be that easy. So once you've cut your pasta, the recipe says to let it dry hard, and that takes about a day. But if you want to make this all in one day, that's okay. Leave it for an hour. It's going to get hard enough because we're going to be boiling it afterward anyway, so not a big deal. Whenever you are ready to boil your pasta, just add your broth to a pot. If you are going to be using an unsalted broth, make sure to add some salt in there, and set it over high heat until you get a rolling boil. Then gently add your pasta and boil for 8 to 12 minutes. The length of time is really going to depend on 1, how thin you rolled your pasta, and 2, how you like your pasta. So if you want it al dente, maybe 8 minutes. If you like a little looser, maybe 12 minutes. Now as our pasta boils, let us get to a climbing that lasagna family tree. We begin our journey at the bottom, with the roots of etymology. There is debate about even where the term lasagna comes from. One theory is that it comes from the ancient Greek word laganon, meaning long strips of thin pasta. Another theory is that it came from the ancient Greek word lasanon, which meant a trivet, and then in Latin that word was turned into lasanum, which meant more of a full pot, so that could refer maybe to the pot that the pasta was being cooked in. Who knows, you know? Lasanon, laganon, discuss! But as we move up the tree onto the first branch, we find an actual dish that might be a predecessor to our modern-day lasagna. Patinam apiciam sic facies, or patina alla apicius. Yes, that Apicius, who we dealt with in the Dere Coquinaria episode. There's a recipe in the book that reads a bit like a layered pasta dish, and a bit like what you might find in a middle school sloppy joe. Chicken, fish, turtle dove, sow's udder, or whatever else you can think of. And that's an actual part of the recipe. Whatever else you can think of. So whatever mystery meat you end up finding, you layer that with sauce and herbs and something called laganum, which the 1st century BC poet Horace describes as sheets of dough deep fried in olive oil. But while the construction is lasagna adjacent and there is an ingredient that kind of sounds like lasagna, we really have to move to a totally different branch of the tree before we find a dish that we would recognize as something like lasagna. In the early 14th century, a cook believed to be from Naples contributed a recipe for lasagna to the Liber de Coquina. It's the first recipe where we see cheese introduced, and it's that recipe where I mentioned you cutting the pasta into squares 3 fingers across. Also, it describes eating it with a stick, so you would like skewer the pasta and bring it up to your mouth, because they didn't have forks. But that lasagna wouldn't have been super cheesy like we think of when we eat American lasagna today. Instead, it would have been just lightly sprinkled on, and we know that because of the Black Plague. Stay with me. In 1348, Marchione di Copo di Stefano Bonaiuti, imagine having to squeeze that onto one of those "Hello, my name is" name tags. Anyway, he wrote about the mass burials that were happening in Florence at the time. Earth would be taken and thrown down on them, and then others would come on top of them, and then earth on top again, in layers, with very little earth, like garnishing lasagna with cheese. Macabre, but useful for our lasagna recreation today. And that brings us to another 14th century recipe from the form of curry, the one that we're making today. Now, this recipe was made about 70 or 75 years after that first one that I mentioned, so if you ever find on the internet people from England claiming that they made the first lasagna, they're wrong. And you will find it out there, but they're wrong. Moving on, one of the most important cookbooks of all time was written in Rome in the year 1570. While working for the Pope, Bartolomeo Scappi finished his opera, which simply means work, no singing involved. And I will definitely do an entire episode dedicated just to this book, probably multiple episodes, because it is so paramount. But suffice it to say, it typifies Renaissance Italian cooking like none other, especially in its use of lots of spices and lots of sugar together. Scappi's torta lasagna is made with pasta and provatura and Parmesan cheese and butter, and then also has a liberal amount of sugar and pepper and cinnamon. And if you're thinking, well, that's kind of a flavor profile that is a bygone relic of the Renaissance, there's something eaten still today called lasagna da fornel, which is eaten in parts of Veneto around Christmas. It has walnuts and butter and apples, a sweet lasagna. At the end of the Renaissance, there was an ingredient introduced to Italy that would lead to a rebirth of Italian cooking: the tomato. I did an entire episode on the tomato where I made an 18th century Italian tomato dish, so definitely go check that one out. But suffice it to say, it changed the face of Italian cooking forever. No dish more than lasagna. And that brings us to the largest branch on our lasagna family tree, whether tomato-based or not. In Liguria, there is the delicate lasagna verde, which is baked with pesto. And in Marche, they have the rich vincis grassi, which is made with chicken livers and marsala wine and cream and sweetbreads and truffles. Piemonte has lasagna al sangue, made with pork blood. In Sicily, it's lasagna al norma, which is made with roasted eggplant. And taleggio lasagna is made with radicchio, taleggio cheese, and mushrooms, and is still popular today in Treviso. But truly, when it comes to the Jets versus Sharks style lasagna rumble, there are but 2 contenders. Lasagna alla napoletana, which is served in Naples around Carnevale, and lasagna bolognese al forno, which is served during special occasions in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy. These 2 lasagnas cannot agree on anything, even the spelling of lasagna. In the north, they spell it with an E at the end, which is plural and refers, I guess, to the many layers of lasagna. But in the south, they usually spell it just with an A at the end, which refers, I guess, to the singular lasagna as a whole. And those spelling conventions went across the pond because in England, they spell it with an E at the end, and in America, we spell it with an A at the end. Meh. In Naples, it's made with wavy sheets of pasta and is stuffed with ragu and meatballs and ricotta cheese and mozzarella and sometimes hard-boiled eggs just for good measure. Then up in the Emilia-Romagna region, they make it with flat sheets of pasta that are tinted green with spinach, creamy bechamel sauce, meaty bolognese ragu, and lots of Parmigiano Reggiano cheese. Each insists that they are the true Italian lasagna, and countless families have been torn asunder in their constant civil war. Now, regardless of where you stand on this very important debate, it does seem that there is a lasagna for pretty much every occasion, for everyone and everywhere, including places outside of Italy. and we're going to cover those when I talk about that last branch on the lasagna family tree over on Chef Frank Proto's channel, Proto Cooks, where he will show you how to make his version of an American lasagna. Won't you, Chef?
That's right, Max. And I'll teach you how to make a classic Italian-American lasagna like I grew up with. It's got fresh pasta, meat sauce, ricotta, mozzarella, pecorino romano cheese, and a little bit of love. So I'll see you over there.
So I'll put a link in the description to where you can go watch me over on Chef Frank's channel talking about the more recent past of lasagna. But until then, it's time to finish our medieval lasagna. So once your pasta is cooked, pour it into a colander. Then in a dish, whatever size you want, lay out a layer of pasta. Then a thin layer of cheese and a sprinkle of powder douce. Then repeat twice or thrice. I'm going to be doing thrice since I'm using a small bowl, but if you only get twice in there, twice is fine. And there's our lasagna. 14th century English lasagna. Now this lasagna is not baked or anything like that. At least it doesn't mention it. So make sure to put the cheese on and everything while those noodles are still hot, because the cheese is kind of melted, looks pretty good, but I think if they were cold, it wouldn't. Now as far as eating this, a fork would be great, but as I mentioned, they didn't have forks, so I'm going to be using a stick, like the Blvd Coquina suggests. Let's see how this goes. Stab it. Okay. Like, pry it up. Okay, I'm sure that they had a better way of doing this. This cannot be the recommended method, but actually that's not that bad, except that this is going to be a huge bite. So turn away, please. That's good. Doesn't taste like lasagna. Like, not at all. It tastes more like macaroni and cheese. Like Kraft mac and cheese with cinnamon and sugar. And yeah, it's weird, but I like it. Okay, yeah, it's good. The stick is not maybe the best. I want a fork, but I'm sticking with the stick. I suggest it as more of a curiosity more than anything else. I maybe wouldn't eat a whole bowl full, but as a little appetizer, that might be kind of fun. Yeah. So that is medieval English lasagna. And if you want to learn more about modern lasagna and how to make one, you can join me over on Chef Frank Proto's channel, Proto Cooks. Link is in the description. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. Did a custard tart take down one of Shakespeare's most villainous kings? Well, no, not exactly. But Richard II's penchant for opulent feasts and fantastic food did lead to him getting into some hot water, which then led to his downfall. So today I'm going to show you how to make a crustade Lombard, or Lombardy custard, which was featured at one of the most famous of Richard II's feasts. Then we'll dig into how Richard II did fall from power and how it gave way to the rise of the Lancastrian dynasty. This time on Tasting History. The crustade Lombard, or Lombardy custard, is essentially just a fruit custard tart, but with a medieval twist. See, while it has eggs and fruit and cream and sugar, which would be normal in a fruit custard tart, it also has some interesting ingredients, like bone marrow and parsley. Bet you didn't see those coming. So the recipe I'm going to use today comes from the Harleian manuscript and reads as thus. Take good cream and leaves of parsley and eggs, the yolks and the whites, and break them into the cream. Beat the mixture until it is so stiff that it will stand by itself. Then take fresh marrow and dates cut into 2 or 3 and prunes, and put the dates and the prunes and the marrow into a fair coffin made of fair paste, and put the coffin into the oven until it is a little hard. Then draw it out of the oven, take the liquid and put it into the coffin, and fill it up, and cast enough sugar on. If it is Lent, leave the eggs and marrow out, and then serve it forth. Now this recipe is kind of cool because it answers a question that I have often wondered, and that is how did they do blind baking in the Middle Ages? They never really mention it in any recipes, but if you just bake pastry, a tart shell by itself, it's going to puff up. So did they use baking beans or pie weights like we do today? And if so, what were they made out of? Well, I don't know, but in this case, they actually use the fruit and the bone marrow to keep the pie pastry down. So I think that's a little ingenious. Now when it does come to the crust, or as it calls it, a coffin, which I think is way cool, it calls for a fair coffin made of fair paste, which is going to be made out of fair flour, which is nice white refined wheat flour. And it's interesting because in the Middle Ages, crusts were often not meant for actually eating. You would eat the inside and then the crust was just there to kind of keep everything together. But since this specifies that it's going to be made out of nice refined wheat flour, it kind of implies that you're going to eat this crust, so interesting. Anyway, that is our first ingredient, a nice pie pastry made out of wheat flour. Now, the original probably would have just been water and flour, but go ahead and make whatever kind of crust you want, or just buy it. Nobody's gonna judge you. I'm not gonna judge you. Next, you'll need about 15 dates and 15 prunes. It's gonna vary depending on the size, but what you want is enough that when they're cut up, they're gonna pretty much cover the bottom of the pie plate. Then about a 1/4 cup of bone marrow, a cup of heavy cream, a 1/4 cup or 50 grams of sugar. Now for this, I used turbinado sugar, but you could use regular white sugar or brown sugar, really whatever you got. 2 eggs, 3 tablespoons of finely minced parsley, a pinch of salt, and the smash of a like button. Now that's not in the original medieval recipe, but I promise you, it makes everything taste just a little bit better. Now the recipe says, if it be Lent, leave the eggs and marrow out, but it not be Lent, so we're leaving the eggs and marrow in. So go ahead and preheat your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit and pull out your marrow bones. Now the best and easiest way to get marrow is to get an actual marrow bone that's just chilled, but you can't always find them. Usually if you have a really good butcher or an Asian market, they'll have them and they'll actually hack them open for you, which is necessary. But if you don't have that or you just can't find it, then you can always get frozen ones. Just put them in the oven for about 20 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and that'll loosen up the marrow enough that you can scoop it out. But I got an entire leg bone, which is, by the way, way too much, but that's what they had, and he hacked it open for me at the Asian market down the street, and so it's gonna be just so much easier to scoop out. I'll show you. Just take a spoon and scoop it out of the bone, and it just kind of crumbles, which is perfect because you're gonna end up having to crumble it anyway, and then set it aside. Then take your prunes and chop them up into 2 or 3 pieces each, and then take your dates and chop them up into 2 or 3 pieces each. You want them fairly small because you want to kind of cover all the gaps when you lay them out. Then take a 9-inch pie plate and line it with your dough, prick the bottom, then spread out the prunes and the dates, and cover those with the marrow. Then, provided that your oven is preheated, pop it into the oven for about 10 to 12 minutes until it's pretty much completely cooked. Now while that's in the oven, go ahead and mince your parsley, nice and fine. Then in a bowl, combine the cream and the eggs and whisk. Now the recipe says to whisk until it stands on its own. Not exactly sure what that means, but I assumed it meant like peaks. Well, because you're using a whole egg instead of egg whites, it's probably never going to get like stiff peaks like a meringue or whipped cream. So if you can just get it, fairly firm, nice soft peaks, that's gonna be good enough. Then add in your pinch of salt and your parsley and whisk that in. Now you'll notice that salt is not actually mentioned in the recipe, so you can leave it out if you want, but salt is almost always omitted from medieval recipes. But we know that they used it, so I think it was just maybe one of those things that, cooks just knew to throw that in there. But I'm just using a pinch, so if you leave it out, probably not a huge deal. So I've made this tart twice now, and the first time I made it was quite some time ago before I started the show, and I made it like a pecan pie, where all of the ingredients would be together in the mixture, in the custard. But that's not what this recipe says. This recipe has you put all the fruit on the bottom, then you make the custard or the filling, and then instead of including the sugar in that, the sugar is cast on top. And I kind of thought, that's interesting. So the first time I didn't do it that way, but this time I did, and you'll see how it turns out. So by now the pie shell should be ready, so take it out of the oven and reduce the oven to 375 Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius. Now you want to let the crust cool pretty much all the way before adding in the filling. But once it is cool, add in the cream and egg filling, and then cast sugar on top. And now maybe in the Middle Ages they would have just used a little bit of sugar, I don't know, but I pretty much covered the whole top with sugar, because I like things sweet and, you know, why not show off, you're the king. Then set the custard back into the oven for about 20 minutes or until the top starts to brown. Now while the tart bakes, let's take a look at the king who ate it, Richard II. So like I said, this is less a history about the custard itself and more a history about the king who ate it, Richard II. I thought I would do it this way because he played such an important role in the culinary history of the Middle Ages. So I thought I could just kind of shoehorn it in. Plus, I think it's interesting, and it's my show, so I can do what I want. Now, Richard II became King of England at the tender age of 10, so it's probably no surprise that he was not exactly down to earth. In an episode a few weeks back about the form of curry, which was England's first cookbook and created by Richard's chefs, I discussed how Richard really loved the finer things in life. He held lavish banquets filled with fantastic food, he wore fine clothes, and commissioned expensive pieces of art. And while all that sounds just peachy, he could be a bit much. He was peevish and capricious and notoriously thin-skinned. He was in need of constant praise. In fact, he was the first English king to make sure that everyone around him called him Your Majesty or Your High Royal Presence. He created an air of divinity around the crown, that kind of divine right of kings. And that didn't sit too well with the nobles of England, because up until then, the English king had really been first among equals. He was in charge, but he had to listen to the whole group, especially after Magna Carta, 170 years before. And it didn't make things better that Richard really liked to play favorites, and the favorites that he chose tended to be seen as kind of upstarts. And many blamed them for counseling Richard into some really poor policies that eventually led to the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. What made it almost even worse was that Richard, to the peasants, came out smelling like a rose, which was ridiculous. And as he grew more powerful, he siphoned off money from the government to give to his favorites and pay for his extravagant lifestyle, including these amazing banquets that he had. In the play Richard II, Shakespeare has his uncle, John of Gaunt, chastise the young king by saying, "Landlord of England art thou now, not king." And truly, it was John of Gaunt who kept the wolves at bay for Richard, because at once he was one of his greatest critics, but he was also his most fervent protector. So fast forward to 1386, and John of Gaunt decides to go off to Castile to press his claim to the throne there, leaving poor King Richard to his own devices. Well, it didn't take long for Richard to elevate Robert de Vere, his #1 favorite and familiaritas obscene, lava, to Duke of Ireland. The nobles against Richard, now known as the Lords Appellant, retaliated by holding what was known as the Wonderful Parliament, which attempted to rein the king in and basically dismiss a lot of his favorites from court. But then Richard just turned around and declared them all treasonous, so yeah, things were not going well in England. And this is where our tart enters the story. On September 23rd, 1387, Richard and the Bishop of Durham held a lavish feast for 2,000 courtiers in London, ostensibly in honor of John of Gaunt, who, as far as I can tell, was out of the country at the time, but I don't know, maybe he was in for the weekend? Seems doubtful. Now, one thing that makes this feast so interesting to us today is that we actually know everything that was served at the feast and in what order. We even have the shopping list. And it gives us a good idea of just how much these dinners for Richard were costing the kingdom. 14 oxen lying in salt, 120 heads of sheep fresh, 140 pigs of lard and grease enough, however much that is, 50 swans, 210 geese, 60 dozen hens, 400 konings or big rabbits, 100 dozen pigeons, 120 gallons of milk, 12 bushels of apples, and 11,000 eggs. The feast was broken up into 3 courses. Each course had like 15 to 20 different dishes, and the dish that finished out the first course was the Lombardy custard. Now, while this feast was probably no more lavish than any other feast that Richard held, the mood in the kingdom was turning against Richard, and this kind of spending didn't really help in the way of optics. See, England was in the 50th year of the 100 Years' War, and everyone was broke paying for it, rich people and poor people alike. And here's Richard having a giant feast for his uncle who's not even in town. So Richard couldn't be that surprised when, on December 19th, the Lords Appellant, headed by Richard's own cousin and John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, raised an army and defeated the king at the Battle of Radcot Bridge, sending his favorite, Robert de Vere, scampering off to the continent, where he died a couple of years later. But that's a couple more years than most of Richard's followers got, because the Lords Appellant purged Richard's court of his favorites and beheaded his top 8. But they stopped just short of deposing the king himself. For as another one of Richard's uncles, the Duke of Gloucester, said, "We do not rebel or arm ourselves against the king except in order to instruct him." Seriously, are we going to buy that? Well, it just goes to show you should never leave a job half done, because over the next 10 years, Richard became more despotic and maybe understandably paranoid, and finally executed most of those who rose up against him. But his cousin Henry Bolingbroke escaped, and a year later, when he returned, he overthrew Richard, declaring himself King Henry IV, first of the Lancastrian dynasty. Poor Richard was locked away and died soon thereafter, ironically, of starvation. But I am not going to follow in Richard's footsteps and die of starvation. No, no. I am going to eat this Lombardy custard, which should be ready to take out of the oven. So after about 20 minutes, the top should look nice and set, but should have a slight wobble in the middle. Go ahead and take it out of the oven and let it cool. So here we are, our crustade Lombard. It smells so good. I kind of thought that because I cast sugar on top that there would be almost like a crust, or actually I was worried that it was going to burn, but it didn't. It was like it melted in. Mwah, beautiful. It looks completely different from the one that I did a while back, so I'm curious to see how the flavor is different too. Here we go. Really good. Nice and sweet. Good amount of sugar, no more than that, because the dates and the prunes are already so sweet. The flavor is similar to the one that I had baked, but the texture is completely different. It's much more, it's like a custard. The other one wasn't really like a custard. This one is like a custard because everything was separated. Now, I didn't expect the marrow to come through. I kind of figured that that would just kind of be like a source of fat in the dish, but I expected maybe the parsley too, and I could taste a piece, but I didn't feel like the flavor infiltrated it in any way. I'm wondering if the parsley is actually meant to give it a sort of green tint, though I don't really see a green tint on this, because they often use parsley in other foods to color their food. Now, if you're interested in learning more recipes that Richard II would have eaten, I have a wonderful playlist down here of all of the form of curry recipes that I've done so far on the show. So make sure to hit that like button, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.